Welcome to another Fenestration Canada podcast.
This podcast is a presentation of Quanex Building Products. For more than 30 years, Super Spacer Tri-Seal from Quanex Building Products has been the ideal warm edge spacer solution for commercial and architectural glass. With its unique triple seal design, Tri-Seal provides structural strength, durability, and outstanding thermal performance in the most demanding applications. Learn more at quanex.com. This is Tech Talks, live conversations about the regulatory environment with Al Yagalis.
Okay, everyone, we're live now, so we're starting Tech Talks episode 5. We're joined, as always, by Al Yagalis, and today we have a special guest, Adrian Edge. So we'll get to know a little bit more about our guest a little later. I just wanna say thank you again to Quanex Building Products, proud sponsor of Tech Talks. So this week, again, we're talking about installation because I think it's a pretty popular topic. So Al, why don't you take it from there? You're still muted. I think this is gonna happen a couple times, basically every show. But I think it's now a tradition, so it's fine.
All right, thank you, Steph. We are now live.
We're now live.
We're glad to continue our discussion today on window installation, and we're very pleased to have a guest with us. Our guest is Adrian Edge, involved in developing an installation training program for the window company he was working for called Starline Windows here in British Columbia. And through that, Adrian has some really relevant experience, I think, to share with us on the subject. And without further ado, I think I'd like to ask Adrian to unmute himself, and we'll start our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Al. It's great to be on the show.
Yeah. Well, Adrian, I recall that your background, you're not one of these lifelong window industry guys. You know, your dad was in the industry, you're in the industry, you've been living, breathing windows and window installation your whole life. Tell us a little bit how you did get involved in the fenestration industry from your previous background.
So you only got one portion of that wrong. My father-in-law has been in the industry for ever and ever and ever. But, unfortunately, I didn't get a whole lot of time talking with him about windows before I found myself in the fenestration industry. I guess lucky, unlucky. So, yeah, my background a little bit before I was in fenestration, I was living on the beach in Florida with my wife. We were working for an organic coffee company. Business development, I was going around creating wholesale relationships for their regional development. We got that moment where we learned we were going to have our first kid, and of course, time on the beach got to end because her family is all in British Columbia. So we packed up, we drove to British Columbia, and about 2 weeks into me having my permanent residency, my father-in-law got me an interview with the owner at Starline Windows. And so I sat down, chatted with him, good interview, and I guess the rest we could say is history.
Well, that's very interesting. So, of course, you started at Starline. What was the nature of the work, that you were doing there?
Yeah, so at first, it was a little bit of tag teaming, figuring out whether or not contract management or project management would have been a good fit. They had just started looking into getting a vinyl installation department up and running for the company. And so I was working with Jerry Mormon, and we were just kind of tag teaming on some of the ideas on how to put that together. So that's really how I found myself in vinyl installation. We started working on it. We were creating strategy around how we were going to approach it. And we essentially articulated kind of the beginnings of what that department would turn into in the first month or so of me being in Starline. From there, actually, the installer certification program through Fen Canada plays a big role in how I continue to go down that path. I was looking for some industry validity in how installers were needed to act, needed to operate in the industry. It's a bit of a rare thing in Canada to find some of those qualifications for installers. And I really view certifications like the fenestration installation certification, commonly called FIT, and I'll just refer to it as FIT because it's a bit of a mouthful to say fenestration installation certification. But the FIT certification really piqued my interest. In the coffee industry, I learned a fair bit about the fair trade certification. It found itself at this funny crossroads in coffee in 90s and the early 2000s, where the coffee farmers weren't making what they were selling. They were below cost. So the certification kind of found itself at the beginning of this like major social issue, and it presented a platform to start talking about it. That certification is probably about 20, 30 years old now. So it's gone through quite a few maturity steps, and it's not perfect, but really, again, what it did is it facilitated this conversation about how this social issue was going to be solved. Of course, at the beginning of working on this installation department, I had no idea that I would feel that window and door installation is a social issue in Canada. But as you start to dig into it, the kind of things that I was seeing through the service department and the field quality assurance department that I was working at Starline, you were seeing buildings rotting from the inside, and it wasn't really happening for the first 5, 6, 10 years. Windows and doors are just a portion of the building science, but you wind up with this really important aspect of the building science world in those windows and doors, because they affect the entire building when no one else is around to fix the problem at the beginning. Anyway, so I'm a little off tangent, so go ahead.
Yeah. So just for a little bit of background, you're talking about the vinyl installation project. So just give us a quick thumbnail sketch of Starline, the kind of company it is, the kind of markets it services with different products, and then where your department was in the thumbnail sketch, where your department fit into that whole thing.
Yeah, absolutely. So Starline was separated into two really major portions. So we had our high-rise division, which was really aluminum windows, high-rise, and that was one section. And then we had vinyl, which serviced single-family homes and multifamily homes. So I was sitting in the multifamily home world. It was actually a really good place as far as I'm concerned at the beginning of trying to implement an installer program. Because the multifamily homes have a lot of professionals on site. And so some of the issues that Starline was trying to avoid, such as service problems that we were constantly coming back to, that were really installation issues. And by the time that we got there, our product might have been warped. It could have had problems that we really couldn't solve through service. The installation department in a multifamily world in British Columbia has a whole series of professionals that make sure that we can have that conversation early on. We could fix those problems early on versus a single family home. There's really not the same kind of oversight. So that's really where I was sitting at Starline, was trying to create essentially the install portion of what our supply relationships already look like.
So one interesting comment you made a little bit earlier when you were talking about the certification and the relationship of certification in the coffee world to social outcomes. And you touched on buildings where you saw rot. And I think what you're getting at is that there are social outcomes to bad window installation. Tell us about your experiences with condo boards that were asking for quotes on window replacement and the kinds of things you encountered.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was one of the more interesting moments, I think, at Starline, was having these conversations with stratas. Because Starline probably shouldn't have found itself in the initial conversation with the Stratas. There's a lot of different professionals that probably need to be involved earlier than the window manufacturer. But the reality is these Stratas and these condo owners were coming to us because they saw the window as a problem. You could see rot on the inside of the sill. You could smell the musty hallways. You knew that there were real problems. So we were being invited to come in and give a quote on how we were going to replace that window, when it really could have been a much bigger problem, and a lot of times it was. You had rot going all the way from the third floor down to the first floor, and you had an entire section of the wall that had been rotted for years. So it was a real eye-opener to really see where that issue is affecting our market. And as far as I was concerned, based on what I was learning about step code and some of the energy changes that are happening in our market, there's a good chance that we could essentially seal up our buildings and find ourselves in round 2 of that if we're not very careful about the kind of details that are being put in. I've heard you say it, and I've heard a variety, I think, of professionals that I really respect in the industry now say we used to build buildings by accident, and meaning the window installation, the door installation was done well by accident because the walls were getting heated and the water was dissipating. But as we close up these walls better and better, and we create a more energy tight envelope, those accidents can't be accidents anymore. They need to be much more intentional. Otherwise, I think you're going to find that the kind of buildings I was looking at least in the Lower Mainland, we're going to continue.
So basically, these are wood frame buildings that probably go back to the early days of the leaky condo crisis. And these are the buildings that have not yet been remediated, whose problems maybe took longer to show up. But this would have been a case where you might say what was standard installation practice at the time, which used to work with no problem. When we started making the wall more energy efficient and trying to add an air barrier and seal it up, the water penetration issues that used to just dry out, now they couldn't dry out in these walls. And the water got trapped within these more energy efficient walls and led to the problems of rot that you've seen.
Yeah.
And of course, anyone that's lived through the last 20 years in Vancouver has realized that a very large number of buildings of that generation have been remediated, where the whole cladding has been stripped off, walls have been reclad, windows have been replaced and sort of built right, the second time around. But it speaks to the fact that you really need to be careful with window installation, especially with respect to water penetration, as you start building more energy efficient walls. That's when there's no margin for error. Even small leakage problems can become catastrophes over time. And I guess that's what you were seeing. Is that right?
That's spot on. And it's, the problem was, there's a human element here that I'm trying really hard to make sure I capture, because it is the passion behind why installation probably needs to be solved. Mold in somebody's multifamily home where you have 30 families that are living in this building is really unacceptable. And it's a problem that is incredibly costly. Like you said, pulling the wall back to the studs and building up is not a cheap thing, let alone the window and door. That was always the thing that really got me with the Stratas, is they were coming to us saying, we really just want windows and doors, but you can't just put in a window and door when the walls are rotten. Like, it is negligent to do so. So you're dealing with this problem that is way beyond the product itself, and the people that are affected health wise was really pretty shocking.
So of course, now in British Columbia, we have teams of architects and enclosure consultants on these buildings that are working very hard to make sure that window detailing is addressed early on. And of course, the professionals participate in the design of that window to wall joint, and are aware of what needs to happen for that window installation to work. and then they go on and they actually conduct water testing of installed windows in these walls. So there's a pretty high level of oversight there. But now tell me, we have all these professionals involved. Why was there a need for Starline to create a team to work on the vinyl department?
Yeah, you're spot on. There were lots of professionals in the room that should be catching every one of the issues from multifamily home. I think the reality, though, for a low-rise wood frame or even a low-rise concrete frame building, these buildings are getting knocked out as quickly as they can. Speed is the name of the game in it. So there are compromises that are made on a building in spite of everyone's best efforts. So the kind of problems that I was going out with the field quality assurance team and seeing were things that were very preventable, but it involved really a training of installation details that the industry just doesn't have. There is just quite frankly, a lack of available training, basic understanding of how to protect these newer buildings. I was seeing a lot of gapping with the membrane at the sill where you just have, it's actually where the water testing was failing more often than not, was just the corners of your sill. The water was coming up and through, and as soon as it gets past the threshold, it fails. And that's somewhere that the water is going to leak down and rot out the wood and so on and so forth, back to the same problems.
So who are the window installers on these projects, on these multifamily projects? And, Starline does a lot of residential work as well. So in your market, who's installing the windows in Part 9? Who's installing the windows on those mid-rise wood frame multifamily buildings? Are these trained window installers? So who's doing the work?
So, and I'm not going to knock the industry because I think they are trying to do, honestly, I often found the installers were trying to do the best they could with the information they had. They weren't perfect, but they were also being pushed around. Yeah. So the people that were typically doing the installation were framers in the Lower Mainland. That was the most common. But siders were also known to do it. Sometimes it's just laborers. It's really whoever the site could get to install those windows, which often meant that the people that were installing the windows didn't necessarily have a very strong background in getting them in, which means that they probably were going to miss details that today are really important that didn't necessarily used to be important when they might have learned it via past experience. That whole, I've been working in the industry for 30 years, may not fly today. Your brute experience may not be enough to understand the details of protecting modern buildings.
So would Starline have any say over who installed the windows?
Very little. I mean, really, it's you're wrestling with general contractors and developers on what their choices are for trades. That's just not a thing. You do the best you can with what is there, and we would even try diligently, I think, to be proactive. And our project managers would be having conversations with the site and making sure that things were being done appropriately. We had an engineer that was showing up and making sure that all the structural elements were being taken care of appropriately. We had a field quality assurance agent that was showing up with water testing and making sure it was all done appropriately. And it didn't matter. At the end of the day, if you weren't involved in it, there's no way to ensure that it's all going to be done right. That those are all very direct. They're very direct solutions for dealing with it. You get 1 or 2, 6 windows out of that. You won't get the entire building. You will always miss something.
So what then, what's the outcome of this for a manufacturer afterwards?
Sorry, again?
Well, in terms of, you don't have control over who the installers are. The builder chooses who's going to install those windows. You try to help them out with guidance, with some training, with some quality. Your guys show up before water testing to make sure there are no obvious problems that might result in a failure of the test. But ultimately, you're not controlling that process. But what happens 6 months afterwards down the road? What happens before you get paid?
Yeah.
I guess I'm getting into this area of servicing windows, right?
Yeah. And I'm really speaking to maybe 40% of the buildings that I understood at Starline. It's 6 months down the road. Things have gone poorly. You are doing your best to service the windows and doors that are there, meaning that you're adapting them so that they operate in a simple enough way that the customer can use it and use it well. You don't necessarily have a lot of confidence that it's not going to leak over time, that there's not going to be a lot of issues for that customer. But 6 months down the road, the customer is asking you, please help me close out this project. I need to close out this project so that we can get paid from the developer, from our customer. So you're doing your best to accommodate the best you can, which really, again, puts speed in perspective versus putting quality in perspective. That was common. I found we were regularly being asked to kind of just come up to the plate and deal with it.
So in other words, you would have to, at your expense, resolve operating problems and performance problems due to the installation over which you had not much control.
That's right.
Yeah. So I guess the goal of your training program then, what was the goal of that training program internally?
Yeah, internally our real goal was to decrease as much of the service as possible. That really we wanted to see the service tickets from multifamily home decrease as much as we could, because it was really taking a serious drain on that department. And it was costly, and it's really just overhead. Maybe if you're sending people out for service on items that it's already been paid for, it's just a loss. So being able to create a department that we potentially had the opportunity to create a revenue source as well as take care of some of our costs was an easy equation for us at the time. The actual implementation of it is a little more tricky. As I'm sure anybody that has taken on supply and install probably can attest to. Once we actually got on site, and I probably should preface, we spent a lot of time making sure our installers were well trained. Almost a week of just safety-oriented training. Not to mention the in-house putting windows and doors into the hole over and over and over and over again until the sequencing was perfect. Until we really understood and felt confident that each one of them was going to be able to operate without a significant amount of management. They actually all went through A440.4 training under my wings. That we spent probably about a week where we just drilled 440.4 into their heads. And I think the end goal for me on that was that they clearly understood the envelope, and that when they got to places where they were having conversations with professionals, they were not just some dumb installer on site. That was unacceptable. That was one of those things that I felt early on in learning about what the issues were on install. That was a big one. It's just we have a tendency to belittle the people that are doing the job, which was unacceptable. And our people were not going to be like that. So they got to site. They were awesome. Sorry, go ahead. You're about to...
So basically you wanted your installers to have a level of understanding of building science that you could get from A440.4, that they understood the role of, I guess, air barrier, vapor barrier, weather barrier, that they understood that things like flashing details are important. They understood how windows work. They understood the things you had to do right to make sure that they worked properly in service. And also that if you had a consultant, an enclosure consultant, talking about the installation with them, they could engage with the consultant at that consultant's level. Like they understood the language, they understood the concepts, and they were able to talk and be conversant with the installation terminology and concerns of the building professionals. Right?
That's at least to the best of our ability with the time that we had. I mean, it's a lot of information to chew off of. A440.4 is not a simple document. I feel like I was lucky to have a team that was very dedicated to being leaders in the market. Like I sold them on that idea right up front when I hired them. It's like, we are going to be leaders in the market. That is just what we're going to do. if we're not going to do that, then we should be doing this. And they really took it to heart. And so I had a great team that really was dedicated to that concept. So they did, like I said, they came up to the plate and they swung hard and they did really well. Unfortunately, we found there was a lot of delays on site. We wrestled with trades quite a bit. Framers that brought the walls, put the walls in, and they were a half to 3/4 inch out of plumb, where the building is literally leaning in for 5 floors of a wood frame building. And you can't do a lot about that. As a window installer, it's not like I have a lot of power over the framers. All of those problems eventually work themselves out, but it's a lot of time to incur if you're going to try to pitch for window installation as a sale.
Yeah. Well, that's so I think this is kind of a background, tell us now about how you got connected with the Fenestration Canada installer certification program. What's the connection now between your Starline experience and the FIT program?
Yeah, absolutely. Forgive me, Fenestration Canada, but I started this relationship off because I was furious about the certification. I was just irritated. I hit the criteria for a qualified, trained professional when it came to installation, and it was asking for 1,000 hours of hands-on experience. And I unfortunately just heard so many times that comment of, I've been working in the industry for 30 years, and that wasn't enough. Like, I was running into people that weren't shimming the sill. I don't care how long you've been working in the industry, but if you can't shim the sill, I don't know what to do. I don't know how to make that better. So I was pushing on Fen Canada about that portion of the certification. I believed in it. I believe that it is a way to solve this social issues, to create a standard for us to rise to. Hopefully there's regulation and there's all kinds of other supporting features about it. But at the beginning, just having a viable certification in the industry is a huge step. So I had conversations with Fen Canada about it, and they were very supportive. And eventually I found myself on a training committee in Fen Canada, getting to kind of shape what that direction looks like. So I was lucky enough to be working with Ron Edger and Jason Sadler on the training committee, putting together the vision of what the fenestration training direction was going to look like. So we actually created a 5-year vision of what that looks like, and at least what we imagine the maturity of the training from Fenestration Canada supporting was going to look like. So that's kind of the gist of my time with Fen Canada. I did a lot of lunch and learns. Terry Admonson was kind enough to join me on one of them, and it was just a lot of talking about the kind of issues I was dealing with. So it's just a perspective. I've been at this for about a year. That's actually one of the more, I think, rewarding aspects of this for me is, although these problems are pretty massive and they have huge consequences, and it's a problem that the industry has been kind of poking at for a while, there really isn't a lot to this. There is. I mean, there's a lot to learn about building envelope, and I'm still so surface layer on it. But the actual solutions to installing windows with green screen application, or to deal with tighter buildings, that's all there. But connecting the dots is a lot of where Fenestration Canada is planning to put its foothold next.
So I guess the idea is that if we had a recognized pathway to qualify installers, to make sure they had that level of skill, that they understood what was involved in plumb, level, and square, right? This is like the fundamental number one question, and yet often is not adequately dealt with.
And by the way, it was the place where I failed my installers on their endorsement. So I created my own internal endorsement program. Okay. I failed them on square, level, and plumb, and measuring the opening more than any other element. They just would not do it because they assumed they already knew the opening. It's not their fault. It's so common to just assume it's right.
So what are the problems that come out of that? If you, uh, which plumb level square conditions, in other words, what happens when you fail to take them into account, and how much time or trouble is it really to check it out before you start?
Maybe 10 seconds to really do that properly, like to make sure the plumb level and square is there. The kind of problems that you deal with never end. Like if you don't deal with the plumb level and square right then and there, good luck trying to make sure the vent is going to close correctly. If there's a vent, you're going to have a problem. And if it's vinyl, it's a spaghetti product. It will shape to whatever hole you put it in. So if it's trapezoid, your window is now a trapezoid. It was not designed to be a trapezoid, I promise. I mean, it might be actually. I hate to put words in people's mouths, but typically, no, not meant to be a trapezoid. So it's one of the funny issues is if we just make sure that the opening is within tolerance. And A440.4 actually gives you a fair bit of room for tolerance. That there is really somewhere between a 1/4 of an inch and 3/4 of an inch on any given side that you can play with. Which is great. It gives you some leeway. Of course, it's based on the product too. Not all products really can play with that threshold appropriately. But that's one of those areas where you just have to be connected to whatever manufacturer you're talking to.
So, basically, you're in your experience, you've identified that really installation of a window requires more than just the skills of a framer. First of all, the framer built that wall that was crooked or out of plumb, possibly. But again, you don't want to blame the guy who's actually installing the window for that. But potentially you are confronting less than ideal existing conditions, and you need to adapt to them, to mitigate that. But I think you've come to appreciate that you need a level of training to do this job properly, and it's not as simple as nailing through the nailing flange and walking away and expecting you're going to have a window that functions the way it's expected to in a modern building.
Yeah, absolutely. But to the benefit of the general contractors I worked with where we ran into trade problems, if you just let them know that there's trade problems and that there's issues that you can't surpass, at least as the window manufacturer, they always gave me the time of day to have that conversation and corrected it. Always. I never had a moment where the general contractor came back after me and said, nope, just do your job. That didn't happen.
So when you had problems with the existing opening, walls out of square, not plumb, to the point that your window would likely not perform if it was installed in that wall, you're saying the builders took that seriously and they rectified it.
They did.
But of course, you brought that to their attention and pointed out the problem. Yeah. An untrained installer may have just accepted the opening as it was and tried to make the best of it.
Oh, right. In the scenario in which you have that wall that's out of plumb, you probably could throw a window into it and it survive for a while. But a 3-point locking system on a door doesn't fly. Like you're going to put the door in and you're going to get the first lock is going to go in pretty easy. The second lock, you're going to have a little issues trying to get it in. And the third lock just won't. Like it won't click in. So if you can't lock the door, or you can only lock half of the locks, you probably should put your hand up and say that that's going to be a problem. But how would you really know that if you weren't a professional and knew that product and knew how that was supposed to be installed?
So before we go to the questions from our callers, I thought I'd ask you one or two more questions. So your focus, was it only on multifamily buildings, or did you deal with single family buildings as well in this training program?
Yeah, for our installers specifically, it was only multifamily homes. So I was dealing with anywhere between 2 and 12-story wood and concrete buildings. And the single family homes, I spent a fair bit of time learning the service side of, that I was often sent out on investigations to understand what was going wrong. But no, for the most part, my focus was on these multifamily developments. And again, because there were professionals there that I was going to be able to go to and say, this is a problem, please help me fix it.
But the problems you dealt with at multifamily, you know, the same problems exist in single family buildings as well, in the sense that the rough openings may or may not be in good condition, and the level of skill required to deal with that rough opening problem is just as great, right?
Absolutely. And
In other words, you still need to know those same things to deal with those problems. You might be at a custom home with, you know, tilt and turn windows and doors and mulled together in large assemblies. Um, you know, you got to resolve those you could have a whole nest of problems if you don't know how to deal with that situation.
I would say the technical elements of installing a window really doesn't change from a single family home to a multifamily home. The only thing you really run into differences is environment and how many professionals are on the site. Otherwise, if you knew how to install windows well for a multifamily home, you're going to rock at single family homes. You'll I trust that those homes will last a lot longer for you if you know how to put the envelope in correctly.
Well, that's great. So I think, Steph, do we have any questions for Adrian from our callers?
We actually don't as of now. I guess
Okay.
Adrian explained, or you know, but we also didn't invite people to ask question yet. So I guess we'll do so right now. If you guys have any question or you know comments about what was discussed about here, I think Adrian, your path and your career within the industry is really unique to you. So you know you have your own point of views too, and I feel that maybe someone would have a different point of view or something to add. So we would like to hear from anyone here on the call. I also wanted to take a second here to mention. So we've been discussing, okay, so when you were with Starline, so just to make it clear, I guess it's with the COVID and all that stuff together, now you're what we could call a free agent, right?
That's very kind. Yes, I'm looking for where I want to jump to next, and I know I'd love to stick around the fenestration industry. This has been fun. It's been about a year getting to understand it at some depths. That you know the rotting wood, bad installation is a very quiet social issue, and we talked about it recently, Al and Stefan and I. It's not a sexy topic. It's really hard to make window installation something people want to bite off of, but it is a social issue as far as I'm concerned. It's one that'll be a lot of fun to. I say a lot of fun. It'll be really exciting when we start to see some of the real solutions, and I really think that we are moving in the right direction.
Yeah, for sure. And you know, like it would be a shame to lose someone passionate about the industry, as you are. And I think I'm just putting it out there. If you guys need a good asset in your company, Adrian's there. So we do have a question now from Terry. I think Richard wanted maybe to ask a question, but basically just wrote your name. So we'll wait for part 2. So here we have Terry saying, thanks for participating today. The industry has been talking about the quality and challenges of product installation for decades now. The problems are well known, and yet finding support from stakeholders is still difficult. Developing a robust national program is costly, and without a regulated audit process or incentive to the uptake is minimal. Do we wait for potential problems again, or push government utilities and other stakeholders to support effective training? And what's your thought about how?
So is that question directed to me?
Yeah.
Okay. So
you're on the spot.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Terry and I have talked about this in the past, and I guess my feeling is it's both. I mean, it's a chicken and egg situation in which you have to try to hatch the egg and hope there's a chicken down the road. You're really running after both paths. So, I mean, going after government proactively now while we have the resources before it becomes a bigger problem, which I fully expect is going to be a bigger problem. I think is really important and is responsible, period. I think in BC, we've been really lucky to already have the water testing going on for these multifamily homes. And it's really one of the first places where you get to see some of the later problems earlier on. It's very difficult, I think, to see some of the long-term repercussions of poor installation until you're already there, until you're already seeing it rot, unless you have some mechanism in which you can really get to visually and physically see the problems. So I think it's very important that we continue to run after a solution, even when people go, I don't know if we really need a solution to a problem that doesn't exist yet. I think we probably have enough history in the fenestration industry to understand that if we tighten the envelope with our current details, we're going to find problems. I don't know if that answered your question clear enough.
I would guess so. If Terry wants to chime in, I'll invite him again. And he's mentioning that it is an expensive egg. That's his comment about your answer.
And I think that just means that we need to bang our head against it until it becomes a less expensive egg. Yeah. It's one that there's probably limited hands-on resources at this point, and we see it. Like, where the training committee is trying our best to put together what training opportunities are available in the country, and there's just not a lot. And I realize it because it is very expensive to put together a good training program. But even the basic resources of understanding some of the more detailed nuances of rain screening, some of that does exist. Actually, BC Housing did a great job putting together a document recently that outlines some of the pictures and the diagrams of what you actually should be doing in an installation per this rain screen new development. But like many of these things, you have to pay for the documents that help you understand how it works. So the more widely available documents just don't have much of a business case, unfortunately. Hopefully in time, those resources, as we mature this market, will become more readily available.
Good. So we have the actual question from Richard. So he's saying, would you agree it's critical to have the municipal inspections and all manufacturers on board with any program and enforced and approved installation program?
Yeah, regulations. So the idea that the provincial and local and federal governments are aligned on how these are implemented. Absolutely. I think one of the benefits we have is, at least as far as my understanding, federally and provincially in BC and then Canada, there is an ask from the government for these initiatives. There's language very clearly about training in construction and with fenestration. So this is one of those areas where I know that there's the want, at least from that high level down, being able to create a concrete solution and get everybody to agree to it. That's the real task. And I do want to make sure, I started off with, I got into Fenestration Canada because I was frustrated about the certification, but it also had been like 2 weeks from the time that it was released that I ran into it. So I was really lucky to kind of find myself at the beginning of my role in fenestration and to be right at the beginning of this certification. So we're about a year into Fen Canada releasing this certification, which I think we're just moving through the maturity steps necessary to get to a place where we can start having these kind of conversations. And I do think that's part of the goal for us.
Yeah, and we've seen a lot of changes and a lot of things happening in this certification program and within the committees. Like you mentioned it, with the team working on it now. I think it's looking good for the future. That's all I'm going to say about it. I don't know if you agree, but you being part of it on a day-to-day basis almost.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think we're heading down the direction in which we're going to start providing things that the industry hasn't had yet. And one of the more exciting things that's coming up is the section of the fenestration website that will actually have the training opportunities there. Yeah. That's as far as I'm concerned, you're going to have a hard time finding another place where you're going to find all that information at the moment. I had a terrible time trying to track that down.
That's true. We have Steve saying, even as a building official, we are limited to how much we can push, how much to push. A certified fenestration installer would be nice to see in the code or reference document. Yeah. So I think we can all agree to that, right?
That's awesome, Steve. I totally agree. One of the places where I was pushing on BC Housing and some of the lunch and learns was I wanted to see they typically have sections of their documentation where they're referencing a qualified installer. A lot of times I was spending my time just asking them to break out what qualified means. I think that's one of our bigger opportunities, is to take language like that and to start attributing certification that has some viability to that qualification.
Good. Let me check here what we have.
Kyle Cartwright has an interesting question. Steph?
Yeah. Do you want me to ask it? You want to go ahead?
Oh, sure, I'll ask it. Kyle Cartwright says, hello, Adrian. What would be your stance on leaving a job site if the openings or membraning is not adequate or needs to be corrected? With site schedule delays, that may come from leaving a site and the pressure from the builder to keep things moving. What power does or should the installers have to ensure their work is done correctly? How would you suggest installers make their voice heard on site if there are issues?
It's a great question, Kyle. It was very challenging. I would say that oftentimes in the couple sites that we were working through, it was a conversation with the general contractor almost first. I was talking to the super on site, in which I would bring up the issue. If the issue didn't feel like it was being dealt with there, I typically pushed it to the envelope consultant, which was typically the last case scenario for me. If I wasn't getting any answer from the two professionals that I really trust to solve that problem, we were walking off of site. We can't be responsible for bad installation issues, because when the water testing starts coming and my windows start failing or doors start failing, the cost of it in British Columbia was crazy. I mean, I was looking at $2,000 per water test. I mean, I could sink my entire profitability in that department in just a handful of windows failing. And from a business point of view, I couldn't afford it. So that was how we dealt with it. It was first talking to the site, making sure that we were clear about it. If they were just pushing on me and telling me schedule is the only thing that matters, again, from a business point of view, I had to step back and tell them I'm sorry. I really can't. It kind of worked. Meaning there were times in which it was a bit of arm wrestling, but we always solved the problem in a way that I think really protected the customer at the end. And that has to be the goal. Whatever your decision is, that's the high road.
And I think you were alluding to earlier, if you take the time to explain to the builder what the risk is, what the downside is, right? That it ultimately, I mean, on the one hand, the builder might say, I don't care, it's going to be a window problem, it's not going to be my problem. But if it affects the schedule, if it affects completion, if it slows things down to deal with the problems later, do you find that, in other words, I think what you're saying is that it's worth engaging the builder and helping the builder appreciate it's going to affect them too, not addressing the problems with the rough opening, for example, up front.
Right. Well, and again, I think that dialogue only really happens when the builder can be used professional. That you're not there to just knock out the windows and walk away. That you are committed to the life of their implementation. That was particularly, I think, important in those dialogues.
But also, you know, how hard or is it to make the case that, look, if the conditions are not right, if the opening is not suitable for the window, and it's installed anyway, it's going to be a problem window for the rest of its life, right? In other words, so clearly you can't proceed under those conditions, and clearly, like the nobody's going to be happy down the line. The occupants won't be happy. The architect won't be happy. So do you find that it's sometimes difficult to make that case with the super on site, or
it depends.
maybe you talk some more about how that works out, or are there tips, are there ways to kind of get their attention to deal with it?
I learned this lesson really early from the field quality assurance guy at Starline, is build your relationships right up front. Every single person you interact with, figure out how to be there, how to be connected to them. Be a professional, be awesome. Like I said, build that relationship, because during the project, you're going to interact with them so many times. It doesn't matter if they're having a bad day. You need to be the best person they run into. That's my only suggestion for that kind of scenario. That if you can build a good relationship with them, those conversations are way easier. But if they're pissed off with you already, like right from the get-go, there's no conversation. They're going to tell you to go do the thing, and you either are going to tell them no and piss them off further and try to get more professionals involved, or you're going to find some happy medium to have that conversation. But I think you should always be striving to have a healthy conversation with those professionals, even when they are not necessarily having a healthy one with you.
So we have right now we have like something like 5 to 7 minutes if we want to keep it around an hour. But if you guys have a little bit more questions, we'll try to take them. We have Zaina here. I'll try to. So she wrote a little bit. Quite a little bit of comments here. I'll try to to put that all together in one. Yeah. Well, she mentioned that she thinks that government funding will be difficult to get to write a curriculum if the industry doesn't support it. Why would the government will not either? So getting good training program in place, and then you can go and ask government for funds. But then she says. She specifies that she doesn't mean that government would fund training, but they would support an industry-driven program. Maybe not financially, but like create the poll. That's what she thinks. And she mentioned that BC Housing, along with our association Fen BC, they did put a best practice guide out there, and it's been pretty well received. And she says it's being revised right now to meet the new code. She's asking a question too. Is there a timeline for national training to be available? So I don't know, Adrian, if you want to get this ball.
This is a really important point that we've talked about multiple times. Fenestration Canada, from our point of view at this moment, we are not going to provide national training. The idea is that we will act as a web to connect the different training opportunities and to try to support them the best we can. Does that answer it from your perspective too, Stefan?
Yeah. I would say that it's not something we didn't look at. We did consider it. Went to the board and the committees and back and forth. And what we realized ultimately is that there's so many, with all the provinces and all the different realities, it's really hard to. It's not impossible, but with the resources and also with the interest, I would say, because this is an issue, but what real interest is there to actually create this whole program? How many people would go through the program from the get-go? It's not as easy as we would think, even if it's a problem, right? So once we saw all of that, what was decided is that this is a real regional regional training. There's a national part to it, but within FenCan we have the certification. So we would rather work with partners in different regions to make sure that the training is relevant to the region. So because here the main thing here is that we want to achieve the goal, and the goal is ultimately for the installation to be done the right way, as much as possible all the time. To have good installers, and that's the end goal. The end goal is not to build training empire or certification, what I mean. So once we had a good look at all of that, we felt that partnering up with different provinces, like private companies, colleges. There's already a provincial association providing some sort of training, which we think is the right way to go as of now. That's what the committee seems to think. So that's the direction we're going right now. And the only thing I can say is that we're working really hard to provide and to solve the problem. So that also means that there's nothing that's always set in stone. If there's a better way that comes up next week, we're going to address it and see if we could go this route. So that that's what I would have to say about it.
Yeah, I think that sums it up really nicely. The only thing I would add is that we've been really lucky to see some of the regional partners already exist in the country. There's already opportunities out there for that training. For Fenestration Canada at the moment to take on creating a program that probably already exists, or at least the framework already exists within different bodies across Canada. Maybe not the best use of resources.
Yeah, and I see that Zaina's asking, so how does the FIT exam fit in? So, well, what I would answer to that is that we still need a national certification, which we do have, and but we need to also maybe add regional aspects to it. So that's what we're looking at. Even in the certification, we'll see how we can do that. But I still think that at this point, this national certification is 100% relevant. Is it 100% what it should be? Well, there's still work to do to make it even better and better, and we're never going to stop working on it. But I still personally think it's really relevant. I don't know what you guys have to say about that.
Yeah, again, I kind of reference my experience with the Fair Trade certification in the coffee world. It takes on a certain dialogue of social issues that couldn't exist without it. So bridging that threshold between being dysfunctional to I'm on a road of improvement, the certification kind of takes on that responsibility. So continuing down the route of a national certification, or at least to spark that dialogue and to connect some of the quality resources, I think is essential to the benefit of the industry as a whole.
Good. So we have a follow-up. So we have a couple more questions here. We'll try to do this quickly. So follow-up to Cal's comment. So a couple minutes ago, a window supplier could and should make proper install of their product related to their warranty. Unfortunately, this can create an adversarial relationship with the builder-installer, leading to a difficult future relationship. Terry thinks, he says, I think we all have been faced with installation issues that we fix knowing it is not product related, but they just do it to maintain relationships. A mandated training program could help solve this. It would help solve the issue.
Yeah, it will never be the end all be all. You are never going to capture all of the installers in the province, and you're not going to capture every building. But man, it makes a couple very positive steps, I think, in the right direction.
We have Zaina saying that recently their local specification association put on a webinar about manufacturers' installation specs, and they say they may not be enough. So does FenCan look at manufacturer specs needed to be clearer? And I think, Al, we touched on that. Like, if it's not last week, like some manufacturers were saying, well, our specs are really clear, and so that was one. But Zaina here say that saying that some people might think the specs might be like an issue here. What would you say about that?
Well, I think what we're talking here are not specs so much as installation instructions.
Yeah.
By and large, manufacturers generally don't seem to be providing very detailed installation instructions.
Okay.
And in a way, as the walls in which we install windows become more complicated, tying into the enclosure, doing a rain screen wall, you're getting beyond what can be documented in a concise way by a manufacturer. And that's where, we're moving into a region where relying on manufacturer installation instructions may not be enough, because the installer needs to have some knowledge of the correct way to tie in that window into different types of walls. Are you dealing with a rain screen installation or a face sealed installation under the code? What is the minimum required in each case? In a sense, I think it does require more skill on the part of the installer, and installation instructions alone are not going to do it. If you provide a 20-page manual of detailed installation instructions to your customer, are they going to read it? If the user of that document is a siding installer or a framer or a laborer, they're not going to look at that document. So, I've written installation manuals for companies in the past, and if you really do it right, it's going to be a 20 to 40-page document. And now, of course, the products I dealt with were a little more complicated than, let's say, a sliding window, but still, there's a lot to consider. So yes,
Well, you know what? As always, I think we're approaching the end of the show, and we're magically finding our next topic. So looks like it, because it feels like we could go on this this potential, well, I'll say issue, but topic next week or one of the next shows, because I think that there's something to discuss about, and if they don't feel that manufacturers provide enough information, well, there's a discussion to have about that for sure. Maybe we could just go with one last question. Let me check here. Yeah, see, so we already have reaction to this point. So I think we'll make a note to discuss about this. Should we give installation more installation information from the manufacturer in the next few weeks? So we'll go with Kevin here saying, "Hi Adrian, my apologies, logged on a little late, but I wonder if you addressed replacement windows in the older home, in particular where 100 plus years old brick or stucco is involved. Obviously we cannot get behind the brick as 99% of homeowners don't want to remove it. We wrap the rough opening, and in the case of stucco, some companies cut over a couple of inches and install the window with a nail fin and then install wood and clad over it. Would it not be just as well to go with a fusion welded brick mold right to the existing stucco, because in the end you still have to apply a seal from the outer edge to the stucco? Thanks." So maybe Al and Adrian can try and answer.
I'll give my 2 cents before Al really should take this over. But the renovation work when it comes to installation is incredibly complicated. And that particular detail, when you're thinking about rain screen, is especially difficult. Brick, 100% the most difficult substrate I dealt with when trying to think about rain screen renovation. Stucco, it's if you got the nailing fin and you cut the stucco back and then you put a piece of trim board over it, as long as you could remove enough of the details internally to be able to put the proper rain screen application, it works well. Man, it's a lot of work. Renovation's one of those places where it's give and take, and understanding the building and understanding the dynamics of the building. At the end of the day, I always emphasized that I wanted an envelope consultant on site with me anytime that we did a renovation, because there were things about the dynamic of that building that I wouldn't really know without their help. I just made it a point that interface was something that we couldn't know.
Would you be...
I'd like to, in response to that question, I would like to make a plug for Kevin to consider a document published in BC called the Best Practices for Window and Door Replacement in Wood Frame Buildings. That document was published about 7 years ago, 2013, I think, and it's currently being it's going to be revised this year. But that's a project that was initiated with the Old Window and Door Manufacturers Association of BC, and then was published through FEN BC. and the Homeowner Protection Office of BC when FEN-BC was created, when WDMA became FEN-BC. But the long and short of it is that best practice guide does address your particular use case, Kevin, and other installation use cases, and provides excellent guidance for replacement window and door installation. It addresses low exposure situations, what we would call windows that are somewhat sheltered from driving rain. And it also addresses windows that are fully exposed to driving rain. And it addresses a variety of wall types and product types. And it provides a pretty practical installation method that actually addresses, that provides one way to deal with all of these installation type scenarios. And it's a document that is probably still available. And I think if you send an email with your contact information to me or Steph, we can put that information, make the information about that best practice guide available to you, and maybe we can attach it to the to this webinar when it's posted on YouTube. So
I feel that that now would be a good moment to give
an
your
excellent
contact.
resource. Yeah,
Yeah.
an excellent resource, and I think that might be a topic to touch on in a future webinar as well.
So can you remind us your email address just to make sure that everyone gets it?
Sure. So it's my first name Al, A-L dot, last name Jaugelis at fenestrationcanada.ca. Great.
So I think of course we found other topics for later. Now that we've been at it for an hour and 10 minutes or so, maybe I want to just ask Adrian last few words and a few last words, and maybe we can wrap this up and see you again next week.
Yeah. Thank you guys for having me on. It was a blast getting to rehash the last year or so.
So, well, thanks a lot to everyone who attended. We hope to see you again next week. I have kind of a feeling on what we're going to be talking about, but let's see what we want to do with that after the show. So just want to thank again Quanex Building Product, proud sponsor of Tech Talks. This has been really good, really fun to do the first few episodes really, and we're getting a lot of good feedback, guys, so just so you know. And so we plan on keep doing this, and so just look it up. It's also on YouTube for those who missed something or just want to re-listen to it. It's on our website, it's on YouTube, on our Fenestration Canada page on YouTube, so don't hesitate to go get your Tech Talks fix. So see you again next week. Thank you.
See you next week.
Thank you.
You are a member and want to be part of the live recording of Tech Talks? Easy. Visit fenestrationcanada.ca and sign up for the next show.